Now the question is, are we? Well, before we ask questions about being live, this would be really helpful if we had some way of looking to see if we were vertical or horizontal.
Is it on YouTube?
Yeah.
I'm going to go to YouTube on my.
All right. Well, you go to YouTube. I'm going to introduce us. Welcome to Book Time with Ryan. I am Ryan, and I am joined today by Commander Kyle. And we are going to be talking about, I'm going to say the whole name of this report. Report of the cruise of the U.S. Revenue Cutter Bear and the Overland Expedition for the relief of the whalers in the Arctic Ocean from November 27th, 1897 to September 13th, 1898. And now we're going to see if we are horizontal or vertical. Vertical, sideways.
Why don't we flip our phones? Let's see if that does anything.
Is that better?
Yeah, give it a second. It might. Oh, yep. Oh my gosh, this is so good.
So much better?
So much better.
Oh man, all that preparation for framing.
Oh yeah, excellent framing.
Oh no, we are not supposed to be sideways. Thank you, Diane. I thought that I did something so it would not do that, but apparently I still suck at this. All right, so we are talking about the cruise of the U.S. Revenue Cutter Bear and the Overland Expedition. I am wearing a Revenue Cutter shirt. This is actually Bear on the shirt, and I'm wearing something that says Coast Guard Bears. Kyle has on an Alaska KFC shirt that has a bear on it. Because in Alaska, is that fried chicken is actually polar bear?
I won this at a charity auction, so no big deal. I think it might have been at least $15.
I mean, and when was that? That was a while ago, so that's really more like $50 now, probably.
Oh yeah, adjusted for inflation.
Inflation. I think my screen's a little crooked still. I see too much of my ceiling. I hate it. All right, well, tough. So just a little bit background. Kyle is a commander in the Coast Guard. He has time in Alaska, and he has an Arctic Service medal. Kyle, can we see can we see your medal? Wow.
Now I have to put the caveat on this. I earned this during summertime, so might not be as cool as some people's. Like Lieutenant Jarvis and Lieutenant Berthoff.
What a name drop.
Yeah.
And Dr. Call.
Oh yeah, we can't forget Dr. Call. Especially foot hygiene is very important.
Very, very important. I don't think these medals existed back then, but they had their own medals created for what came, which is detailed in this report. Now, Kyle and I both have copies. These are from the government printing office. Oh, someone's writing 6-7. Good job. All right. Do you know who that is?
No.
Well, that's cool though. Thanks for being here, Ricardo Tello. Yep, we have the same book. Kyle's is in a Mylar cover. He actually had a clamshell box made for it, which is pretty sweet. Mine, as I've said in the past, is from the Steve Fawcett collection.
Wait a minute. Hold the phone. Oh no, I don't have that.
No, I don't think he'd have more than one copy.
No.
He's dead. He died in a plane crash in 2007. This is the Steve Fawcett collection of adventure and exploration. He had like 2,000 explorer books, and when he died, they were auctioned off, and this was one of them. Ours also has a map in the back. These were printed in 1899, so I was a little worried about. Mine doesn't have all the protections that Kyle's has, so John 44057. Yay. Happy. Thanks, John. John's here and he's happy. Oh, wow. People are really negative comments. I've never actually opened the comments for this. Well, thanks for being here. Yeah. I don't cut out comments either. So, just keep them coming. That's cool. Great. Thanks for everyone being engaged. I printed mine out because I was scared to rip it up and and it actually came out to be a lot of pages because they're all pretty small. So we'll give a little bit of background into the kind of situation, what things were like back then, and then we'll go into what actually happened. Now we are looking at this starts in 1897, November 7th, 1897. And what was happening at this point was we were at a time where, if you want to think about whaling starting more in the U.S. on the East Coast, out of New England, Nantucket, and New Bedford, especially, and this had been going on for hundreds of years, and eventually they had pretty much overwhaled uh, the Atlantic Ocean and started moving around the Cape to what is it? Which Cape is that?
There's multiple capes. There's Cape Hope.
Cape of Good Hope.
That's a different one.
It's not that one.
Cape Hope is in Alaska. There's a lot of capes.
Oh, Cape Hope. Yes, yeah. The one that's around the bottom of South America. So they would. This is pre.
That's Good Hope.
Good. That's Good Hope.
I think so. It might.
What's the one at the bottom of Alaska, Africa? I thought that was.
We're not here to talk about Africa or South America.
All right. Well, whatever it was, they had to go around. There was no Panama Canal. They had to go all the way around, and they had updated the way they were doing whaling. So they had tries where they could process the whale meat and the whale oil, the blubber, on the ship. So they didn't have to go to a port to process it. But they had been overwhaling the Pacific so much that they had to go further and further to find whales. And they were basically pushing the whales up into the Arctic, into the polar regions. And each year they would have to spend more time to get what they were looking for to make it cost effective to go whaling. So they had to spend more time out finding more whales so they could come back with more whale oil. The problem was.
Keep in mind, this is a generation, 30 years after the United States purchased Alaska. And yes, that was 1867. So this is even though it's a generation after Alaska was acquired, the federal government had not really reached up there to this location in Alaska so much, except for the Revenue Cutter Service, whalers, sealers, fur companies. But the Russians had already been there for over 100 years. But that's another story, maybe.
No, that's good. And it's not a state at this point. It's a territory. It's underpopulated. We were in the middle of, or at the beginning, what point were we at of a gold rush? So we had a lot of miners. The Klondike.
Yeah, the gold rush had already started, but the gold rush was in the interior of Alaska, the Klondike, the interior of the Yukon. There's three ways to get to the gold rush. One was to go up through, the current state of Washington, current territory, province of the Yukon. The other way was to sail up to Juneau and then cross into the inland of Canada. This is Alaska, so that would be kind of go this way. And the third way was to sail all the way around to the Yukon River, which is way up here in Alaska. If you imagine my hand is Alaska, this is what they do. Then you could sail up the Yukon River. So the third way to get to the gold rush would be the location that we're talking about today.
Did you know that Juneau is the capital of Alaska?
Yes.
Cool. All right. I think so.
Not always. For a while, it was for a little bit of time. It was actually Kodiak, but that was Russian Alaska. Then it was Sitka for a long time. Sitka, Alaska.
Dude, I'm so glad you're on this because I don't know any of this. Kyle was stationed in Kodiak, Alaska, which is I think the second largest island in the U.S.
Correct. Right? Yes, after the Big Island of Hawaii.
That's amazing because when you look at it, you're like, all right, that's a little island. When you look at maps of Alaska, but it's actually huge because the map of Alaska's enormous. And that's the other thing you think about the distances we're talking about here. Just the remoteness of Alaska is on another level than we're used to in the U.S. and probably anywhere except for maybe Siberia is used to. So whalers are going further and further north. They're kind of cutting it as close as they can before pack ice moves in the Arctic and cuts them off from being able to get out through the Bering Strait back south where they can get to warm water ports like Seattle or especially San Francisco. And what happens now is in 1897, 8 whaling ships get stuck. They get iced in near Cape Barrow, Alaska, which is the northern point of Alaska, and not the northernmost point of North America, which is on the other side. But it's really high up there. It's way up there.
Reykjavik. So today it's referred to as Ukjavik. I think I'm pronouncing that right.
That's yeah.
That's a native, the native word for the location.
And I read that they voted that in like in 2016 or something. Before it was called Point Barrow. There's actually a couple. And the weird thing is, what we read about, there are areas named after people that are covered in this event. Like, is it Corbin or something? It's the guy who owns uh, the like trading outpost near Point Barrow. There's actually the town is named after him now because he was like the presence. Kyle kind of mentioned it though, but this is so remote that the real presence, the federal presence over this territory, is the Revenue Cutter Service, and that is the precursor to the U.S. Coast Guard. In 1915, they would be renamed and combined with a few other services. So we have these 8 whaling ships. They're iced in. There's no food really up there. The other thing you need to know about is not only have we overwhaled different oceans and really kind of driven a number of species out of existence, including the gray whale in the Atlantic. Um, you also have the fur traders and the whalers and the sealers wiping out the coastal populations of caribou and bear and anything that can be trapped and skinned and traded for fur. You also had the seal populations wiped out, and these native populations, which were centered a lot of times on the coast, and they could move a little seasonally, but they were centered on the coast. Now they're facing starvation and they're destitute because they don't have the food. They lived really day to day on capturing what they needed to live off of. A lot of that food has been either wiped out or pushed towards the center of inland part of Alaska, and that has caused the people who have stayed back a lot of trouble trying to find food and dealing with starvation each winter, especially, and has also kind of changed the makeup of the coast. So you don't have these larger coastal settlements. You have smaller settlements that are pretty poor and a lot of disease, and then you have people that have moved inland, which doesn't really help out in this situation because if they're whalers, they're along the coast.
Yeah, speaking of sealing, so Revenue Cutter Bear actually started as a commercial sealer before it became a whaler. And so it was part of that, the cause of that issue that you just mentioned, Ryan. The Revenue Cutter Bear is actually famous in Alaska, along with a couple other revenue cutters. Get there before the rush. You can Google that later. That's a clever phrase nowadays that is tied to the Coast Guard back then, the Revenue Cutter Service back then. But the Revenue Cutter Bear, led by the famous rip-roaring Mike Healy, was famous across Alaska. They served as not only the postal service, but the justice system, and kind of like partially the governor of Alaska along the coast. There was a formal governor of the territory, an army appointed governor of the territory, but a lot of the coastline properties were not visited. The coastline cities and towns were not visited by the army that often. They were visited by the Revenue Cutter Service. They also served as a mobile hospital. They would bring doctors and the mail every summer up from San Francisco, where it was based.
Yeah, and they were the commanding officer of Bear or whatever was the Arctic cutter at the time, because they weren't there all the time. They had to go home and resupply and let people rest. They were commissioned while they were in Alaska as, I don't remember whether, like, it's not justice of the peace necessarily, but it's something where they were basically provided the ability to almost act as judges, but especially almost like a sheriff kind of. And then they would be sworn out or whatever at the end of their season, and then the incoming ship, that commanding officer would be sworn in to act. So it wasn't something that they maintained all the time, but they carried back with them. The Bear started as a sealer. It was built in, I think, 1847 or 1846 in Dundee, Scotland. and spent its first few years, maybe 10 years, um, successfully in, I think, Newfoundland. And then was purchased by the U.S. federal government to help with the rescue of the Greely expedition, which my next video is about that rescue and the Greely expedition. But it was purchased by the U.S. federal government in 1884, and then in 1886 was transferred to the Revenue Cutter Service, to the Treasury Department for use by the Revenue Cutter Service. So that is kind of the background into what we are looking at. You have 8 whaling ships stuck above the Arctic Circle off of Point Barrow. Now we're talking distances that are pretty crazy, because I think Kyle is a marathoner. I've done a half marathon. I think walking 26.2 miles would be a bit of a hike. Running it would not be comfortable. But we're talking about like ships that are 50 miles apart, that when you're transferring between those ships, you're doing 50 miles. Some of the ships were actually further west or further east, closer to, I don't know if it's Cordell Island or something. There's an island that's just over the border with Canada. And no, not Wrangel Island.
No,
It's a big island.
I forget.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of Canada, but there were a couple ships off of there.
I would compare it more to backpacking, so the process of, we're going to get into the story, the process of, traveling up there once the lieutenants and the expedition landed. I would compare it more to backpacking or dog sledding, not marathoning. So every day they probably traveled between 15 and 30 miles, while they were traveling, which is pretty insane.
Well, and it's not flat. It's not flat everywhere. People assume, and they're mostly, they ended up traveling 15 to 1,600 miles. A lot of that was along the coast, and we'll get into why they had to do some of that. But in my mind, I picture these ice fields a lot of times just being flat, smooth. But there are cracks. There are things that they'd have to hike up and down, like carry stuff separately. They couldn't just. It wasn't just a flat streak. It was like they're doing 10 feet up, 20 feet down. And the ice was also, sometimes it was weak in some areas, so it was dangerous. They could break through, they could get hurt. Things weren't stable all the time. So not only is it not, you could probably jump on a dog sled and do better time if it was completely flat and hard and just a straightaway. But it's more complex than that. Sometimes they realized they had to go around a mountain, but then there was also sea ice. But then the sea ice would blow off of the shore, and then they couldn't do that, or it was too weak, or it was virgin ice or whatever, so it wasn't packed enough in, or I don't know. There's a lot of reasons they couldn't just go straight. So yeah, it definitely is much more backpacking than sprinting. Also, like we're in the middle of a little winter storm here. I was just outside. It feels like 13 degrees. They were looking at -70 at times, which I just can't imagine that. That is, you have very little time before you start worrying about frostbite and exposure. And they also, something I don't think we think about typically, although I felt this, Kyle and I were just up in Boston with Noelia for the Secretary's Cup, which the Coast Guard Academy should have won. They did have a mascot, unlike the other team, but it was a very close game, and I was wearing my bear coat and I sweated. And the problem that people would have in these Arctic expeditions is they would get hot with their manual labor and would sweat. And that sweat could be very dangerous if they didn't dry off quickly, because it would drop their temperature inside their clothing once they stopped exerting so much physical once they stopped their physical exertion. So they had to worry about that too, that they had to stay dry. Or if they stepped through something and their feet got wet, immediately had to dry it off, or they would have frostbite in no time.
Or they couldn't take a break. In that circumstance, you either stop, dry off, or you keep exerting yourself to keep the water from freezing in your gloves and in your socks.
And you need to keep moving. Like, you would see times where people just had to move. They had to move because if they stopped moving, the blood stopped flowing from the the core temperature areas where it was heated up, and your body needs a lot of heat. You don't realize how much heat your body produces to just operate, and like half of that's your brain. So it's you have to keep moving. And all right, so we what happens is they're stuck earlier years before. A number of whaling ships have been they were stuck, and they I mean, this may have been 50 years before or something, but they like everyone died or something. It was really bad. So Washington is notified that there's these ships, they're stuck. There were ships that were leaving that realized like other ships got stuck too. So it wasn't like no one knew they were there. They knew they were there. They didn't know exactly what condition they were in, but part of the problem was because the food, the kind of the native populations of caribou and bear and foxes had been pushed so far inland that there wasn't going to be a whole lot of available food there. Also, because of the ice, there weren't really spots where whales or seals could come up for air. So they weren't there. So that wasn't an option. So they're worried about not only starvation, but also scurvy is a big concern. Even at this point, they still don't know. They have an idea that citrus fruits help keep scurvy from really picking up, but they don't know. They still know it's connected to vitamin C. I didn't realize that that's
Yeah,
like in the 1940s or 1930s that they figured out that it's connected to vitamin C.
yeah. But even Captain Cook, learned of that preventative strategy about maybe 100 years before. Yeah.
Yeah, and natives obviously were not experiencing it. So there's also some red meats that keep it away. But um, so Washington gets a heads up. Hey, there's a bunch of whalers. They're stuck. They might die. We need somebody to go out and save them. The president gets in touch with the Secretary of the Treasury, who gets in touch with the I don't even know what he was called at that point, the director of the Revenue Marine or something like that. It wasn't the Captain Commandant yet. Um, and basically, Bear had just gotten into home port. They had just got done with their patrol. They were in San Francisco, and they got a heads up. We need you to respond to this. You're the closest. You're the best. Can you do this? And they took volunteers. Everyone volunteered, and they got underway. They went to Seattle, reprovisioned, and headed north. And Kyle has definitely read this part of it and has a better familiarity with where they were pulling in. So do you kind of want to give them an idea of like the trip up, like how far they're going out, where they might be stopping, or you've definitely stopped in one of them, Dutch Harbor.
Yeah, so that was their one of their bases of operations. So they went from San Francisco north. They stopped in Seattle, and then they went across the Gulf of Alaska, which is challenging this time of year. It was I think it was October and November of 1897, and then they pulled into Dutch Harbor, which was a whaling town. It's actually the Great Circle route across to Japan. So there's also commerce coming, from Japan to and from San Francisco. That's where just commerce would come.
I
If you
think it
think of
may
the
have been
world.
November or December, because I think the dates on the report, that's when they started moving from San Francisco, like
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. So my biggest surprise at the beginning of this book was that, all the way in Washington, D.C., they had local knowledge of what was happening in Barrow, Alaska, which is information that traveled by word of mouth from Barrow, through the native tribes all the way down and was picked up and taken to Dutch Harbor, information that went over to so they had this knowledge all the way in Washington, D.C. And in addition to the knowledge of the situation, they had knowledge of the local towns and specific traders who controlled herds of reindeer in specific locations, Point Hope.
Mhm.
So that's what surprised me is that all the way in Washington D.C. in the year 1897, they had this information. It wasn't that they could pull up a phone book or Google
They did have
or whatever.
telegraph.
Yeah, that's true.
But I don't know like how extensive. Like I don't really think that was probably all the way. I mean, obviously not from Dutch Harbor. They're not telegraphing from there. So
Yep. Yeah.
yeah, there's definitely a delay. But also like that does go on to just show you how desolate it is. Like there are individuals who are known as that point of contact for hundreds of miles, and um, that's what you see. So they head north on Bear. They have a group of really their crew, their regular crew. And the message that they got. So this is the actual report. It includes the messages from the Secretary of the Treasury, from the commanding officers to the individuals that were actually part of the Overland Expedition. And it's very thorough. I have not ever written a report that's like this. This is so thorough and was presented to Congress. Um, so they're headed north, and Bear's on its way, but they don't know what they're going to run into weather-wise, and they eventually get iced in. Bear is almost crushed too by ice, and they realize that they need to stay further south for the winter. They still have other things they have to do. There's kind of there's hunting of seals by other countries in U.S. waters that they have to prevent. So they do some of that. They're also bringing mail and transporting people who may be injured or in trouble or were in San Francisco and needed to travel back up. They were providing some of that. But while they're doing that, they've selected their small group to head out. They also find a native to provide some of the guidance for the area, and they select 3 guys from the ship. Number 1 to lead it is
Lieutenant Jarvis.
Oh, Jarvis, yes. Lieutenant Jarvis, First Lieutenant Jarvis. I don't know when they switched the ranks, like the ranking system.
You should go back.
I wish I knew. So First Lieutenant Jarvis now would be a Lieutenant JG. Now the other thing is he graduated from what would become the Coast Guard Academy, where Kyle and I went. When it was the School of Instruction of the Revenue Cutter Service in 1876. He graduated in 1883. So this is, 14 years later. See that? I did that math real quick.
I'm impressed.
Yeah. And he's still an O2. So there had to have been less ranks.
Yeah, there was no admirals at this time.
Yeah, there was a Commodore, but mostly, or I don't even know there was a Commodore at that point. There were captains. I don't think there was an 04 position. I think the rank of major. I don't know, maybe major, but no lieutenant colonel. So maybe no commander. I don't know. But he was selected as to lead the Overland Expedition. The second in command was Second Lieutenant Ellsworth Berthoff, a hero.
Man, you can Google him. He's very storied much later in his career.
Yeah. He basically saved the Coast Guard twice from becoming part of the Navy, and he was the first Captain Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard when it switched over and joined with the U.S. Lifesaving Service. So, and then the third person was the ship surgeon, Call, who I've heard the least amount about. And I don't really know how surgeons worked back then on ships, like if they had a rank, if they were part of a service, if it was contracted, or how that worked. But those were the 3 of them, and they had a native from a local island who eventually got really sick and had to be left behind, and not left with people to help him at a fort. And then he returned to his town after a few months. I think he had bronchitis, or I don't know, something, pneumonia. And then they basically, their directions were, what we didn't provide in the background is reindeer are not native to North America. There is a subspecies. Reindeer and caribou are the same species. Caribou are all wild. Reindeer they've been domesticated for 2,000 years. There are some wild reindeer, but they've been domesticated for 2,000 years. And a while back, this was, I don't know if it was Hellroar or Mike Healy, but it was definitely Bear, arranged to have reindeer. It was taken from Siberia to Alaska because of the issue with the starvation of the natives. They basically brought domesticated reindeer over and then taught natives how to breed reindeer and use reindeer as an alternative source for food, because and probably clothing, but they didn't have that before, and the native herds for caribou had been pushed inland. So they were told, you got to go find I don't know how many if they got the total number. Eventually, it was somewhere near 400 domesticated reindeer. Drive the reindeer from these different locations. I think it was like 3 or 4 locations. Drive them up to Point Barrow to provide for the food for
Yeah.
the stranded whalers.
So even though they deliberately planned this out of San Francisco, buying a ton of flour, I'm talking tons, metric tons of flour, salted beef, and other supplies. Dog sleds, which they ended up not using because they were not the same style of dog sleds used by the Alaska natives. And they started picking up reindeer as they went further north. They started with 12, and their target was to buy a bunch, the majority of the herd from Cape Hope in Alaska, from a tradesman, a commercial trader they knew had about 400 reindeer up there.
What was his name?
I
Was it Lap?
Lap.
Like this
Mr.
guy,
Lap.
this guy's also a hero. The stuff that he did to bring the reindeer with them, he gave like 290 reindeer, and he was really the expert on reindeer breeding and reindeer driving. So it was Lap and his boys drove the reindeer up the coast with them.
Yeah, so they're in dog sleds. In two, they start together, and then Berthoff and Jarvis separate before they cross the Norton Sound into Kotzebue. But we got to think about. Let's start where they start. They start in a town called Tunavuk, or I hope I'm saying that right. Tununak, which is near the island of Nunivak, Alaska. I've never been in that area. And then they start going around the coastline. And at one point they cross the peninsula, but then they pick up all these reindeer before they cross the Kotzebue Sound. So their strategy
Where
is
you
follow the
been?
coastline. Yeah, so I spent the summer in Kotzebue, Alaska, a small town which is got 2 or 3 fantastic restaurants. A really cool town with special folks who are great Americans.
And Berthoff camped there.
Yeah, so he went ahead. They split up. So they were in teams of dog sleds. Each team had a handful of dog sleds, a handful of people, and then the herd of reindeer would follow the second team with Lieutenant Jarvis.
And
Berthoff went ahead weeks ahead, and they were communicating through cairns and dropped notes on the beach, which is wild to me.
Yeah. Well, and they also they didn't have money. Like they didn't have this bag full of money where they were like, we're paying for this. They were basically operating on credit. And they were basically like, hey, we're good for this. The US federal government, the US Treasury will pay you for this stuff eventually. We'll make sure that you have the supplies you need to survive. And you kind of just had this real, I think it must have been unique to that area and that time, but kind of a trust that you would stick to your word, and that you could trust them. And even if it put you in a bind, you would help somebody out because they needed the help, because you might need the help too. So they split off. They were using dog sleds. The thing that you don't really realize is dogs and reindeer don't mix. These are dogs on dog sleds. These are not like sweet dogs that you want to play with and keep with your kids. They're pretty ravenous animals that want the food. They're driven at times where they're kind of starving. They're only fed at night because they don't want them to run on a full stomach. But they also they play out, which I didn't realize play out was. They kept using play out in this report. Played out means they're basically done. They can't be used anymore. And so eventually they switched, and they had to have training for this, to reindeer driven sleds. And reindeer don't naturally pull sleds, so they had to train the reindeer to pull. And you basically had a lead reindeer, and then the way they would line up the reindeer differed between natives and I guess the white man that was doing it. So they switched because the dogs were sinking in too much to the snow. It was too deep, and they were too exhausted that they had to kind of exchange dog teams after a while too. But then they switched over to reindeer. The problem with reindeer is they're really sensitive, and they can be spooked. So they run longer, And they probably do better in the higher climates, but they can freak out, and when they do, they just kind of run off. And if you fall off and they're running, they'll just keep going. And that happened to Jarvis. He got knocked off the sled in a snowstorm and basically dug himself in and was covered in snow. And the other two guys came back after the sled ran up next to them, and they realized there was nobody on it. This was hours later, and they found them. Like that would have very easily been a death, but they
Yeah,
just got
I think
lucky.
that calls to their strategy that they stayed on the coast. They
Mhm.
only rarely crossed, across land. They stayed on the coast and they communicated through cairns. So they kind of knew where the second team kind of knew how far ahead the first team was.
Yeah,
Jarvis's team, how far ahead Bertoff's team was, and they planned to connect in Kotzebue, which they did, and they ended up connecting like 2 days, arriving in Kotzebue about 2 days apart. But
crazy.
Berthoff took a land route. Let's see if I can do this. Kotzebue's up here. And Lieutenant Berthoff went all the way around on the coastline, and Lieutenant Jarvis went across the water, across the ice, only after some Alaska natives convinced him that it was strong enough, safe enough to cross the ice that time of year. I think it was January by that time.
Mm. Yeah, and if you were the second team, you knew you were a day behind, and sometimes you could see them. There was enough. The going, it's a different speed, and you could see like a dot in the distant, like on the horizon, but you couldn't just like catch up to them or signal to them. It was windy and spread out, so it might take you a day or two to catch up if you can. But then sometimes a storm would pop up, so you'd actually have to hunker down, and they might keep moving. If you were the second team, you would get there and they say like, "Oh yeah, that team was just here a day ago." If you were the first team, you didn't know where the other team was necessarily. You just had to trust that they were going to get where you agreed that they would meet. And they also had backup plans. They would say like, "Go here, but if you can't make it here, go here. And if you can't make it there, go there, or just continue on
Yeah.
if you don't see us after a couple days or whatever." The I think I always feel like I need certainty and closure now. Like I'm like, "Are you sure? Do you really need me to do that?" And the way they were operating, they just had to trust that somebody might get there, or they were holding up their end of the plan, because if they didn't, everything would kind of not line up right. And everything did. It lined up right. They got to where they needed to be. The reindeer showed up. They combined herds. For some areas where they needed the reindeer because they were going to starve, they allowed them to keep some of the reindeer. They pulled some of the reindeer off. Some of the reindeer they knew they were going to have to eat. Some of the reindeer they knew they needed to breed, so they would have fawns that they would be able to use in the future for more food. You can't just eat all the reindeer. There have to be reindeer, and they found that some of the reindeer they were breeding too early, and the fawns were dying quickly. So there was a lot lost like that. Some you're going to lose just because they're huge herds. They might be spooked. There might be a storm. Some of them will get separated. They might run off. Um, but for the most part, I think in the end they ended up showing up with maybe 10 less than they started with, and that includes how many they ate and how many reproduced. It may have been like 10 to 20, but out of like
Yeah.
400, that's pretty good. And they had more than they needed in the end, and they were able to bring some of them back with Lap. He was able to take it back to his area, and they also visited some of these native populations and realized like they needed stuff too. That there were some kinds of foods that people wouldn't share with them, and one of the things I think we need to point out is there's still a lot of racism at this point in the world. This is 18, obviously, it's 1897, 1898, but the bear leadership was very, I felt like very on the same page and sympathetic with the native population.
Oh,
They
yeah.
didn't baby them. They trusted them. They thought they were great for certain things. They also knew that there are certain ways they did things, that they didn't want to upset their approach to the way they buried their dead or dealt with feuds and stuff. But they definitely, I felt like they had a pretty profound respect for the natives. I felt like Jarvis had, because there's three accounts basically in this report. Most of it is Jarvis, and then you get the little bits of Berthoff that fill in the points where he was separated from Jarvis, and then you get
Most of
some
the
stuff from
report,
Call.
most
What?
of the report is most of the report is written by Lieutenant Jarvis. I was surprised at the detail, and I was
Yeah,
also surprised. I've spent a lot of time with Alaska Natives in a handful of villages. I was surprised that I just didn't it didn't click that there was villages every kind of day's travel along the coastline. So every like 20, 30 miles, there was a village. And just because of the way they've progressed over 1,000 years, or how the culture survived. I was impressed at the empathy, the goodwill, like you mentioned. They would welcome the expedition into their camps, and they would, the expedition would slowly absorb the technology and survival strategies that the Alaska Natives would teach them. The
yeah,
clothing, the way they stopped using their Western American style tents after a while.
yeah,
They didn't build igloos, but they built similar structures to what you might think of as an igloo.
yeah. Well, and like the natives have already perfected that over hundreds of years in the harshest of conditions. So they
Yeah, so
actually,
often, so the expedition would sleep often in um, the cabins that the Alaska Natives lived in. It was interesting that the way the family structures and the village structure would work is you'd have the families in cabins, and then you'd have all the bachelors, and
yeah,
you'd have the bachelor cabin with um, the widows,
yep,
and all the non-family would be in that cabin. So that would be the cabin they would stay in.
yeah. Well, and they would also a lot of the especially the smaller settlements, they would offer up their best spots because some of these places were very dirty, like just because they had to stay inside. They were filthy, and but they would have areas that were like nicer. And if you came from the outside, they gave you the nicest spot. They would go out of their way to welcome you in and give you what you needed, even if it made it difficult for them in the end. They would offer you up these things, and it's really interesting to. I don't know if it's still like that, but it was, and that's just it's really
Oh
cool to kind
yeah,
of see that. But I also thought like Jarvis had been in the service longer, had been in that area longer, and you got from his writing more of an understanding and respect than I got from the Bertov writing. Bertovs were still respectful, but there were caveats sometimes of like, you got to deal with them this way or that way. Where Jarvis was kind of like, this is the way we're gonna do it. This is the way it works. This is how good they are at these things, and we're gonna learn from them and help them out where we can and honor what we've committed to do for them. And then you got to Call, and Call was less sympathetic, but more of like on a science basis. Like he was approaching it as a doctor, so he didn't really like the shaman, medicine man kind of approach to some of the treatments that people. And he also felt like they were taken advantage of by some of the shaman. That it was more transactional when the medicine man was helping out. You probably didn't get to this part. It was Call's part was way at the end of the book, and he did not appreciate when the medicine man was like, "Well, you've got to give me this and this and this before I save you, or you're gonna die." Um, and that the natives were like, "Oh, this surgeon from the ship is really just here to give me the medicine to help me feel better, and he's not gonna try to get more out of me at the end of my treatment."
yeah.
Um,
Why don't we
so
why don't we so the after they pick up all the reindeer, they're at the Barrow Strait. Lieutenant Jarvis crosses the Kotzebue Sound. It's about 40 miles crossing the water on the ice.
hmm.
They connect, get more reindeer at Point Hope,
And you
and
can't
then
see
it's
40 miles like that. If the risk there is that you're halfway over and then you realize that it's not frozen and you have to turn around because you can't cross like an open lane. So it's still risky when you're doing that kind of thing. That's why they avoided a lot of times going over the water, because you weren't sure to be able to go all the way, or it wasn't clear that it was going to be safe.
yeah. So I was surprised when they got how bad the whalers were doing when they got to Point Barrow, Ukqiavik. A very few of the whaling ships, even though they were trapped, they were still afloat and not crushed. Most of the whaling ships have been crushed. I think there was three that were still together, intact. and the officers of the whaling ships that were crushed had been welcomed into one of the commercial homes, and then over 100 other guys were in one cabin, and it gotten really gross. Think about a cabin with 150 whalers.
Yeah, they had like 100 something. Some of the ships, the crew stayed on the ship, and they had things prepared that if it was going to be crushed, things were kind of prepared on the deck so they could immediately remove it, hopefully in time. But there was like there's a building that was pretty nice, and there were 4 guys in it.
The officers, the whaling officers,
right? And these are not officers that you're thinking like military officers where there's like some kind of rule. And I mean, there were rules, but the anarchy that could have come out of just like stepping away from the crew and these guys, the crew, they were paid for a certain period of time, a certain term, or for the patrol, or for the year or two that they were out, 3 years that they were out looking for whales. So there was also people were disgruntled because they're like, do I still need to follow this guy because my term is up, or this isn't a whaling expedition anymore? I don't need to follow the CO, the commanding officers, the captain's rules because I'm not subject to that anymore. And when they're in a room with 100 other guys and there's discontent, that can really start to fester and breed more discontent.
Not all the ships maintained order and discipline. Most of them, just didn't have it, and the guys were in sleeping in bunk beds, that they built in this cabin with an oil lamp. And if you have an oil lamp going for months and an oil stove, the soot's getting all over your faces, so your faces are sooted and gross and disgusting. Some of the guys just stayed in their bunk beds. They didn't get out. They didn't exercise. There's no medicine. So after you're breathing that, you're not exercising, you have malnutrition, scurvy. These guys are not doing well. I was surprised. Very few of them. There was very few deaths, even though.
Yeah, there was only one death by the time our team got there. There was one death, and it was heart disease related. It was some guy who was going out and wanted to help. He had gotten advice not to do it, but he did it anyway, and then he had a heart attack trying to help move, I think, a sledge or something like that, or he was shoveling, or I don't know. But there was only one death. There were other deaths beforehand because some of the whaling ships were crushed, and also the ice isn't stagnant, right? It moves. So at times where an ice got trapped, it would move like 100 miles and then rotate back around, and they'd see it like 30 days later, and then it would go back out, and it would just kind of come back into view. So that kind of stuff was happening too. So when they got there, they imposed kind of like a military order to it. Jarvis decided they needed to build or prepare another building, separate the groups. So they were in smaller groups, so you couldn't have kind of the mutinous approach sometimes that was festering there to really build up steam. So they separated them out to smaller groups, and then instituted a need for hygiene. They were getting checked out by the doctor call. They were
they took their shoes and socks off every day and were checked out, and their feet were cleaned every day, which it's peculiar, but it's extremely important.
Yeah.
So think about it, like you have a 30-year-old, two 30-year-old lieutenants, I don't know, maybe 35-year-old or whatever, plus the doctor, and then their very small crew of boys, show up, and they have the confidence to institute leadership and convince these whalers to follow their direction. If you had 200 hungry whalers, what you can think of, what alternatively could have happened. So they kept the herd. They kept the herd about 30 miles to the southwest, to keep the herd away from the whalers.
From the whalers, and they had to keep the herds away from town dog populations too. And there were wolves too. There were wolves they had to be concerned with too. But they kept they not only did they have to keep them away from the whalers, so the whalers didn't come and start eating them or killing them. They also had to keep them away when they were going by towns, because it would spook the deer if there were dogs, and the dogs if they could scent the deer, they would go out and try to kill the deer too.
So the confidence these guys had to come impose order really impressed me. Like, I think, could I show up and impose leadership, order, discipline, a routine schedule on 200 people who are close to death, starving, malnutrition folks? Even if I show up with a bunch of food and a ton of flour and other supplies, I gotta imagine that'd be very difficult.
I think so, and I think part of it probably is that these whalers, they know about bear. Like, they know that they're stuck there until it thaws and bear's coming, and they are used to a very powerful bear. That
The ship,
the
not
ship,
the polar bear,
not
not
the
the polar
polar.
bear.
They do have to worry about polar bears, but they're used to the ship in these waters. So the fact that it's the bear probably helps too. But it is, I mean, you really, especially because there was already kind of breaking down of order there. It's a fine line between pure chaos and order, and somehow they were able to do that. And at any time, these guys could have just taken over. They could have just wiped out the three guys that came from Bear, and it could have been pure chaos. But somehow they were able to keep order, which is amazing.
Is that bear on your T-shirt?
This is, yeah, that's Bear.
So it's about a 200-foot long sealer whaler ship. So it's not huge. It's about the size of a 210-foot medium endurance cutter in the U.S. Coast Guard today, with a
Yeah.
crew of about 50, full-time crew. So it's not a huge ocean liner or anything like that. But
There's a 210 right there.
check that out, man. That thing is good looking.
Hmm.
So yeah, they've seen Bear. They've heard of Bear. Bear's a legend at this point. Bear's been traveling to Alaska for 25, 30 years, ever since the U.S. acquired the territory of Alaska. So it's famous at this point.
Actually,
It's been hanging out in Dutch Harbor doing other revenue cutter missions around.
I think 15 years probably at this point, but it's not the first there. So like Kerwin was there. A lot of these officers were on other Bering Sea ships, other revenue cutters too. So even if Bear, like the people, they know the people, and a lot of them switch in and out repeatedly, including the captain of Bear, Tuttle. Yeah. So amazing. It was and they lost nobody. They stayed. Some people they sent south that were in worse shape that needed to be treated more. Some people did not want to continue on with the whaling ship that they were signed on, but then there were other people who wanted to, but their ships were gone because they sank. So there was also agreements where they were able to kind of switch people out, which is pretty cool for them. And then eventually Bear got there and picked up the people that didn't have a ship left, or were too injured, or didn't want to serve on their whaler anymore. And the other whalers that were still doing okay were able to get underway and made it out of the Arctic Circle. There were some that experienced some kind of damage over the year or two. And also you have to remember that these whalers, they go out for years. So they are provisioned to have some, depending on when they got stuck. If they got stuck at the beginning of their time out, they might have 2 years supplies ready to go, provided they don't sink. But if you're at the tail end of it and you get stuck and you don't have the provisions, then you're in big trouble. So there were whalers that either kind of like wintered further east, and kind of, they were in like a lee, so they were protected from the ice. They were still iced in, but they were close enough to an island to keep them from being crushed. They were able to get out, and then some of the whalers that weren't crushed, the ships were able to get out too. But then Bear was there once it pulled in, and Bear had been stopping on the way up to get updates on their way up from the different agreed upon stops where the Jarvis and Bertolf were supposed to leave notes for Bear to give updates on what they're doing and where they are in the process.
So this is June at this point. The crew arrived in Barrow, and they arrived at the very end of March, and then they had to keep the entire population alive. All of April, all of May, and now it's June, the end of June. But so it's been months at this point. The crew has been on this expedition for about 6 months at this point.
Yeah, and 1,600 miles. That's just I tried to show somebody at work what that looked like, and that's really from like Maine to Colorado, and you're doing that without GPS, and you're not radioing in. You're kind of using what's known. A lot of the charts they had were not correct. We forgot to mention that, but uh, part of the reason that Bear was at risk at times was there major storms that come through, but also the charts they're using are not necessarily correct. So they have an area they think they have a lot more water under their keel, and then they get there and they realize they're very close to rocks, or there's land where it says there's water. So once you get into a situation where you can't trust the charts, you really have to be more conservative on how you're moving your ship, and you can't go places that might be, pushing it. You have to kind of say, like, I don't know if this is good water, and if it's a storm, I can't take that chance, because if I do and I sink, then we're really screwed. Um, but also
Yeah,
the charts they had, the maps they had for the land weren't necessarily correct either, or were outdated, and develop or settlements they thought were going to be there weren't there, or were abandoned. Um, so it's crazy distance, and just the fact that they pulled it off with the officers they did, they're legends. Jarvis and Bertov have ships named after them. Um,
Yeah, so they brought everyone back to San Francisco. A year later, Congress awarded the three leaders the Congressional Gold Medal, which is pretty cool.
it was a special
And
medal specifically made for them. And on the thumbnail, I can't find the one for Call, but that's the medal for Bertov and for Jarvis, and it has their busts in the medal. So it's them specifically depicted in it, and their names are on it too. They could have gotten more than that. I mean, they really.
So separately from the story, I was impressed, Ryan, with the quality of the printing. The book that you and I bought, it's 100 and almost 130 years old, and the quality of the paper is fantastic.
Paper is glossy almost. It's
yeah. And then the quality of the photo. Why don't you show them show a photograph? The quality of these photographs. So they carried a camera.
Yeah, the photographs are great.
Yeah, the
here's Lop, not Lap, Lop.
Oh, look at that. So, but that photograph might have been taken at a different time, but the photographs during the expedition are fantastic.
Yeah, let's see. Here's some good ones. Native
the quality of the glossy paper, the quality of the binding.
This is the Belvedere. Belvedere is one of the ships that wasn't destroyed, and actually one of the people from the Belvedere was able to travel south and gave them an update on what was happening before the crew got there. The crew from the Bear got there. But there's a hut. The illustrations, the photographs are amazing. And there's also a map in the back.
Yeah, I get the map.
Are you busting that out? It's very cool. It has all their track lines for the path that each of them took.
Super cool.
The binding is a little iffy, and that's the only thing that kind of had me worried. And that's why I printed off sheets. Then they give you feeding the dogs. Feeding the dogs was a dangerous activity because they would attack each other, and you had to beat off. That sounds bad. You had to beat the dogs that were stronger from them going after the younger, weaker dogs, so everyone got their food. Yeah,
so the map paper is more paper and less glossy.
Yeah,
but I thought about framing it, but then I'd have to separate it from the book.
Yours is in good shape too.
It's fantastic, and it shows where the Bear went, where the crew went.
Can you pull it in a little bit closer so they can just see there's track lines on it?
Yeah.
If you look at the coast, you can actually see some of the lines, and they're labeled by whose line it represents.
Yeah.
Is yours attached to the book?
It is attached to the book.
Oh, mine's separated.
You can see you look at the quality of the printing from 1898.
Yeah. Government printing. Government printing.
They went to Dutch Harbor. So the red is the Bear's track, the black is the Bear's track from Seattle heading up. And then they dropped the crew in Tununak near Nunivak Island. The crew crossed the peninsula, and then Berthoff crossed the peninsula all the way up to Kotzebue, while
Is that near
Jarvis
St.
went.
Michael? Was that where they started it near St. Michael?
Yeah, St. Michael's over here. Sorry, my
Okay.
finger. And then Jarvis went around to get the reindeer from all the way over here at Cape or Prince of Wales. And then the crew met up in Kotzebue and then went around all the way up to Barrow. And
Now,
meanwhile, the Bear, is this black line, doing other missions and other business around, then coming to and from Dutch Harbor. They actually went to St. Paul at least once, and then the red line is them coming back to San Francisco, which is just fantastic.
Yeah. Oh, it's amazing. And you don't get a real appreciation for the distances here, because if you overlay a map of Alaska over mainland US, the end of the Aleutian chain touches the west coast, and whatever that little bit is on the southern part, that goes all the way to the east coast. It's a huge distances that we're looking at here, and it's amazing that they pulled it off. And I think a lot of that was just the trust and authority they had to do it, but also they were conservative in the way they approached things. They didn't take chances because they knew, the risk was high for if they took a chance, and the reward was a little bit better, but it didn't outweigh the risk. And if they died, if any part of that faltered, then the entire mission was probably going to be at risk. So I loved it. Kyle got this book before I did. Commander Kyle got the book before I did. And he's had it for a while. I didn't realize that it was this story when you told me you got it, because he had the box made, and I had a box made for a book, and he had the box made, and I was like, oh, cool, okay, it's a report. And there are a lot of different Coast Guard and Revenue Cutter reports out there that are pretty dry and boring. But this one's not one of them.
It's written almost like a diary, almost. Every day there's like a new paragraph. It's like, January 7th, we went 27 miles, and all these things happened, and then so and so happened, and then we acquired 20 reindeer. It's written with a first person perspective. These are the diaries. It's a letter from Jarvis to his superior, to the Revenue Cutter command headquarters. And so it's a series of these reports, and
they refer to the other letters. They'll be like, as I reported to you in blah blah blah, and then later on you see that in the report, the referenced ones.
I'm surprised these guys had time to take these detailed notes, while they're extremely cold, working their tail off, camping, they're camping.
Yeah.
And then when did they write? Did they write this stuff down as they're traveling? It's a 6 month
trust the process. Just trust the process. Clearly, it's very accurate. They did a great job. I'm just going to trust that it worked.
Or they remember this stuff and write it down when they got back. I think they wrote it down as they were traveling.
And then added, because it does feel like some of the report is narration too. It's not just it would have been boring if it was like day 1 went 20 feet. Day 2 did 20 miles with horses. Well, not horses, with dogs. But there's a lot more of kind of more explanation in the report and description of. It gives you a little more background, and I think it felt less official in some parts, and more of just give people back in DC, because this is a report that went to Congress, give people in Congress a good feel for what it's like. Because if you just give them distances and speeds and the what you're hauling, it doesn't tell them anything. But if you give them a real good feel for, this is what the natives are like, these are the ones, this is what they did, and I also felt like this is really cool to see, especially Jarvis. Most of it was written by Jarvis, but all of them did this in some way. They really, I think, spread out the praise. It was never Jarvis saying I did this, I did this, I did this. He was basically talking about how great the team was, and how none of this would have happened if Lop didn't do this, or Berthoff didn't do that, or Call didn't do this thing, or the natives didn't help out in this way. So he really attributed a lot of success to everyone else.
Yeah, if they didn't have the trust so it's Alaska Native is the right descriptor. If they didn't have the trust of the population, the trust of commerce, the the trust and backing of the faith of the federal government. If they didn't have that, that would be very challenging. If the population and the Alaska Natives didn't trust that they would get paid after the fact, the whole thing would have fallen apart. If they didn't have the skill, the perseverance, if they didn't do the deliberate planning, the deliberate planning that was done in like a week in San Francisco, they got back to San Francisco and, hey, you're going to turn around and go to the end of the earth. And they spent a week to deliberately plan this.
And contingencies. It wasn't just like, let's do this, and if it doesn't work out, we're screwed. It's let's do this, and this is the backup to this, and the backup to that, and the backup to that. So they had fallbacks on certain things they were doing to make sure it worked. It's amazing. It's an amazing story. I think it should get more. It should be a movie. I mean, it would be a great movie.
That's a great idea. We should
somebody make a movie. And honestly, I do think the Bear should get more love than it does. I think it's one of the great ships of any service in the U.S. For people who don't know, I did a review, a book about two books about Bear, and eventually it served a long time, longer than a lot of ships, not as long as 210s, which is a little sad. Um, so it actually did some work in World War II, and then it was decommissioned. It did one of the bird trips to Antarctica, and then it was kind of held on to. It became I think in Oakland, California, it became a museum in 1933, and it was called out of that to go on the bird thing, and then World War II. But it eventually went back to, I think, a sealing outfit, but then they couldn't use it. It was so beat up that it just hung out in Halifax or St. John's or something in Newfoundland for a while. And eventually somebody from Philly bought it, and they wanted to make a like a riverside restaurant that would kind of be like a restaurant museum, which is kind of cool. But they did some repairs to it, and they were towing it from Canada to Philly, and on the way they got stuck in a storm and it sunk. And then I think maybe 5 or 10 years ago it was rediscovered, and NOAA took some shots of it. And it's it's off the coast, because I don't think they recorded where it was. There's pictures of it in the process of sinking when they realized that it was taking on water, and the tug couldn't do anything for it. But it's really like a sad ending for a ship that had, like, it would be like taking the USS Constitution out and then just be like, oh, sorry, we lost it. And you're like, it was like that. So, and Bear, this is one of the major things Bear did, but it has so many stories. You'll see my next review. The first real time that it was used for a rescue, and it was doing rescues for years and years and years. It was the Authority. So this is one of the great cutters ever, and one of the great stories from that cutter that I think exists. I'm pretty sure that's why our school's mascot is the Bears too.
Oh, yeah.
Eventually there was a live bear, but I think that kind of was pulled from the cutter bear being, because it was the Coast Guard Academy was created in 1876, so it had not been around that long before Cutter Bear was really out doing its thing, and they probably weren't like, we need a mascot at that point.
But the Coast Guard Academy was originally a ship. I think the revenue cutter Dobbin, I believe.
Dobbin.
It wasn't built in its present location. I think
the schooner Dobbin.
I don't think they actually started building the current campus until about 1931.
33 is when it was completed. Yeah, it was on the Dobbin. It ended up in Curtis Bay, Maryland for a while. And then it was at, what's the fort? Fort Trumbull in Connecticut. And then it moved from Fort Trumbull, Connecticut to its current location, which I think opened in 33. It's in my Tide Rips, which is the yearbook. 33 is like the original buildings, and that's where it's been since. That's home.
Yeah. Anyway, fantastic book. I wish we could show more pages. I'll show the table of contents in the opening book, but it's.
You know what I'll do? I'll include a link in the description to the PDF that's available through the Coast Guard Historian's website. It's the same book, It's public use. It's a public document from the government printing office from 1899. But if you want to look through there, there's tons of pictures. They're really cool. They're better in the actual hard copy than the scanned in version, but it's still, you'll get a feel for it. It's really neat. Kyle, thanks so much for being here today. This was definitely longer than we planned, but I think like your contribution is indispensable for this. Like, this is the guy who was in the Arctic, has the medal to prove it, has the KFC Alaska sweatshirt to show off how experienced he is. He was on the Coast Guard cutter Alex Haley, which was out of Kodiak. So thanks for coming. Kyle is a longtime watcher and commenter and first time special guest host.
Thank you for the invite.
Yeah. Thanks.
Pleasure to be on Book Time with Ryan.
Woo!
Like and subscribe.
And like, don't forget to like and subscribe. And hit the ding thing, whatever, the bell. I don't know how to say it. Noelia is better at doing the like and subscribe. All right, man. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Bye. I don't know how to actually turn it off, though. That's the other problem.
Do I hang up?
I don't know. There's got to be a way to. Is it this? Maybe it's this. I can remove a guest. Hey, anybody who's still watching, how do I turn this off? This is the problem. I don't know how to do anything. Maybe it's this. Oh, here we go. End stream. I got it. All right, man. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
See ya.